and I've also written on some of these topics as well. And I should also mention, in addition to my job at IBM, I'm also an industry professor at McMaster University and the DeGroote Schools of Business and Medicine. And I always like to keep my hand in teaching. So I teach these days executive MBA, as well as directors for boards of directors and the like, because I think they need to understand this stuff really well to be able to actually lead their organizations. I think that's a missing skill in many organizations. But what I want to talk to you about that you saw in the title of this talk, as well as researching, designing, and educating for the future. I think we're currently at this point where we can't simply be designing for today. And a large part of what we do these days with regard to the research we do, the designing we do, and even the education we're doing, by and large, is focused on what we need to know today. I think we need to be looking at the future. So the three themes I'll talk about is something I call pseudo-design, which is something you shouldn't do. And also talk about futures design for an unimagined future, which is like what we need to be dealing with every day. And then also talk a little bit about the future of design education as well that I've been involved in. So let's talk about pseudo-design. So what's the fundamental problem that we have? So when we think about the typical sort of process, and this is the one that IBM has documented, we start off with doing some research. We do a workshop. I'd say glean insights from that, and that's actually how it should work. You should do the first insights in terms of doing generative research, understand whatever area that you're trying to provide a solution in. You can even get brand new ideas for new products if you do the appropriate generative research, like ethnographic observation, for example. But then what are you going to do with the results? Just a simple, document, that 50-page document that you're going to share with the team isn't going to be really effective at informing the rest of the multidisciplinary team that's going to be creating whatever it is that you're going to be creating. You want to actually use some methods, and that's where I think the design thinking methods come in, and you workshop those continually over time. Then you go do your research. Then you do your design work, early, low fidelity first, and then you cycle through this loop over time. What happens if we don't do the research? You're just going to be doing, any workshopping. You're going to start designing. I argue that you're flying blind, and I like to suggest that the reason why 90% of startups fail is for this reason. They've had maybe two people thought that there was a problem in the world that they're going to go create a solution for, and they may well do some ideation together, some workshopping, and they start to build this thing. And they will argue that, well, you know what, we're going to use agile methods, and if it doesn't work quite right, we can pivot and further adjust. Well, that's an incredibly expensive way to fail, basically, because if you didn't get that problem right in the first place, you're not going to be successful, right? And there's just been so many companies that have failed at that, like startups, and large companies too, for that matter. And I like to say that you don't have to fail fast and often. You should be failing fast and often with really early concepts, but in low fidelity form, maybe even paper and pencil. But the fundamental thing that I want to really suggest here is that whatever you do, even if you're talking about some non-digital solution to a problem, you have to start by doing the actual research to really understand who it is that you're going to be trying to solve a problem for before you start to think about what the solution to a problem might be. So I call doing design without doing user research first pseudo-design. Just like pseudoscience, pseudo-medicine is all basically science and medicine that isn't empirically based. Same with design that isn't empirically based is called pseudoscience, pseudo-design. So what if we did like a whole lot of research and we workshop stuff, but we didn't get around to building anything? Call that analysis paralysis, and there's organizations that do that, and that's also not a good thing. The other thing is, what if you didn't do like workshopping, if you never did the synthesis and the collaborative methods that design thinking provides, the empathy maps, the as a scenario maps, the to be, the ideation, the prioritization grids, all of those kinds of things. If you're just going to do the research and you go directly to design, I call that sort of uncontrolled complexity. The IBM company actually acquired some companies that did that, and they used agile methods, beyond belief. But they basically took one bit of client insight and then mapped it into the design. Rather than prioritizing it, rather than realizing more about it, how it fit with other things, it's an incredibly fast way to make your product highly unusable. So don't do that either. What if you do just a whole lot of workshopping? You don't do any research, you don't build anything, you're just going to stand around either in person with Post-it notes and Sharpies, and it'll look really cool. It'll look like you're really being innovative and the like, but you're flying blind because you don't have anything that you're really basing it on other than your own little concept of what users might be like. And you're not building anything from it. And I like to call that innovation theater. And I would suggest that 80 to 90% of all design thinking is innovation theater. And the fact that it is, and that everybody sees these cool people standing around with whiteboard walls and Sharpies and Post-it notepads, it gives design thinking a bad name. So when you see all this, negativity about design thinking, I think it's due to this kind of innovation theater. And that goes for if you're doing it digitally and remotely as well. So don't do that either. We want to make sure that we're doing research, doing the ideational work and understanding research, and then the design, and then going through the loop. So how do we do some of this research, right? One of the most effective ways of doing this is ethnographic observation. Of course, we borrowed that from ethnography, where you're basically the observer of everything that's going on. And you're not going to intervene. You're going to be understanding and capturing what users do and what they say sort of in their natural habitat. So if you're working for a bank and you want to improve the in-bank experience, you're just going to observe what users are doing as they're entering the bank, as they're in the lines, how they're going through it, and the like. Whatever it is that you're designing, you're going to be starting with an ethnographic observation study, which will get you what users do and say, and that would populate, for example, the empathy map that we talked about before. But what if you want to go even a little deeper? How do you find out what they think and what they feel, in addition to what they do and say? And I like to suggest that structured interviews are the way to do this. Not just talking openly, to a user. Structure your questions that you're going to ask them in a way that are not leading questions. And you want to now also dig into kind of what kinds of things are they thinking. So this was a study that my team did some time ago, looking in the healthcare sector and looking at AI systems. And we were meeting with doctors to find out if we were going to automate parts of their operation, what do we need to know about? What is their, what are they losing sleep over? They talk about that they have missed something in the diagnosis, something in the history and the like. I said, okay, well, AI can help with that, can understand the whole ingestion of the corpus of data for the patient records, and can also look at the entire literature to get an insight into what kinds of things might inform, the diagnosis and treatment plan and the like. And then you get into what gets you up in the morning? What do you really love about what you do? And people will tell us things like, my interactions with my patients, that's the most important thing. So what did that all tell us? It told us that, what we were talking about actually building, a way of actually addressing the concerns that these doctors had was going to be done with the solution we were building. But we also learned that we weren't going to be creating something that would get in between the doctor and the patient. So we had contemplated early on that we'd create this thing that would pop the thing up on the screen that the doctor then could talk the patient through what they're considering. But when we realized that what these doctors really enjoyed the most in working with their patients was directly working with them, we learned that what they wanted was like an assistant that could help them in their office to before they talk to a patient, or even on the way to office on their mobile device and the like. So structured interviews are a great way to go deep in terms of not only what they do and say, but also what they think and feel. And really importantly, for doing any of this stuff, we all carry around now the most amazing ways to capture any information with our cell phones, capturing audio, video recording, and also journaling what we're capturing. You can do this in real time. You have to make sure you get the appropriate approvals and permissions to do that. But you have an amazing ability to capture what somebody was experiencing. And then later, when you actually want to share that with the rest of the team in terms of this is what we need to be building, you've got not only your words, but you've also got actual video that you can show. This is actually the problem we want to solve, etc. So when we think about using design to address today's unimagined problems, I'm going to give you an example. I did a keynote in the fall of 2019 for the Design for America organization in the US. And I made the case for the need for designers to do work for the companies that employ them, and they should be thinking about all the societal issues and environmental issues in the jobs that they're doing. But I think there's also a need for designers to take this amazingly powerful skill set that you have and apply it to these problems over and above your day job sort of thing. So that's the claim or the call that I made. And then literally a few months later, the entire world was hit by the biggest challenge of our lifetimes thus far. And I argued that the COVID pandemic really needed designers to rise to the challenge and actually do what we could do to address that challenge. And so I got together with the World Design Organization and also the Design for America organization and a whole bunch of people at IBM as well. And we put together a COVID-19 design challenge. And people really love doing this and really contributing to this. So we had 7 challenges, 21 teams. We see all the numbers here across 17 time zones, about 225 designers across the board, about half of them from IBM, and about 3 weeks time. And we had basically we did the appropriate challenge statements. So they were the 7 that I talked about earlier. Everything from how could we assist in remote education, because a lot of students had to go home. How could we even help staff that needed to go into the ICU learn how to use and put on the appropriate protective equipment, over to how could we inform people and inspire people to practice safe behaviors and mask wearing and that sort of thing. So each of the teams took one of those challenges and started doing user research on it. They mapped the summary of that information in an empty map and an as a scenario map. Then they started to brainstorm ideas, voted on those ideas in terms of which would have the greatest impact on addressing the challenge that they're working on and which would be the most feasible to do. We mapped that on a prioritization grid. We then took the items that were on the top end of that, top right side of that prioritization grid that were the most valuable, the most impactful, and the most feasible, and built out a storyboard of what we needed to do to address it. We wrote some hills, which are basically statements of who's going to be able to do what with what wow experience. And then they built prototypes all in this 3-week period and got feedback on them as well. So what was the result of that? We had a whole bunch of social media campaigns to address the safe behaviors work, some example of all of those. We also had a solution to easily providing medical staff information, how to wear their protective gear going into an ICU. We had you see them all around here. There's also an example on the bottom here of appropriate PPE, protective equipment, this wonderful design that we didn't actually build, but it was an interesting experience as well. We also had that hand is an example of There was a lot of violence in the home that was happening. And this was one that looked at India and identified a particular visual signature that would indicate that there is trouble in the home and that a woman typically needed to have help and the like. And then we did a whole bunch of work on in India as well on how they could use WhatsApp to deliver education in a way that would work. So this is the kind of work that they developed, and you can see the results of that work at COVID-19designchallenge.org. But that was an example of using the methods we already have today to address major problems that we've got in the world, and with appropriate sort of results. And so the results, you can look at the site for the kind of results that we've seen. We also did similar kinds of methods to problems of job insecurity, largely also due to the pandemic. We did this with MIT. And we also did it with regard to food insecurity globally. Also, another one looking at global health emergencies, predicting them, and actually knowing what to do the next time we get a pandemic. So those are all using the methods we already have to address emerging problems that we're seeing that are quite disastrous that we need to address. Let's talk next then about what about anticipating the unanticipated future? What kind of things, what kind of methods can we use in that regard? So the problem here is the current practices really focuses, as I said earlier, on the present. We do research, we workshop, and we design largely for understanding people as they are today, right? Which is fine, except for the fact we're not designing for the future. So when you look at this, if we look at our design practices, we ask what happened, that's hindsight, what's happening today, and that's insight. We also want to now look at what may happen, and that's essentially foresight, right? So we're currently like here, and what we need to do is actually move over to not only doing this, I'm not saying not do this, but also add the focus on the future, and that's strategic foresight, right? So what does that look like? So a similar, iteration form of scanning for trends and signals, and there's amazing methods within strategic foresight. I recommend you read some books in this area or take further education on it, but it's basically looking for everything you're reading, everything you're listening to, and you typically have a team that captures the kinds of signals, and there might be weak signals of things that might happen in the future. And then you map, and there's a bunch of methods for doing this, just like there is for enterprise design thinking, to capture the mapping and then reflect on it. And then you can prototype alternate futures as well, in terms of if this happens, then we'll design it this way. If this happens, then we design it this way. And think about it for a minute. As we went through the last 2 years of the pandemic, without knowing it, this is what you've been doing, right? So I'm on the board of directors for a nonprofit, a vegan nonprofit that puts on a great big event once a year, a big festival, in-person festival, right? And this is an organization that needed to use these methods to be able to decide, what are we going to be able to do? Is it going to be safe enough to meet in person? If that's the case, this is the design we're going to go for. If it's not going to be safe, or maybe if it's going to be safe, some will feel safe and others won't. What if we did a hybrid model of that event? And what if we really just can't, everything is shut down, we need to go do something totally remote? We needed to design up front, first of all, anticipate what those future directions might be, and then fully think through what might be the scenario. So it isn't the case that, now this happened, now we have to start from scratch and think about what the solution for that situation is. You want to get the early signals of which might be the direction where you're going. Think about those alternate future, and then design for each of them as well. It's really important to make the clarification that we're not sort of predicting the future here. This is more a matter of trying to understand enough information that we have today about potential directions, then to be able to think about alternate futures. And that's really the magic here. There isn't like this one future that we need to go design for. It's really a matter of saying what might be the alternative futures, and then to be able to go in those different directions if then we have more confirmation when we're closer to the future, and to be able to actually go down that path. So The other thing that I wanted to make is that, as I said earlier, foresighting isn't about making predictions. A lot of people think that. It's like, oh, you have this, magic way of figuring out what the future is. It's really about preparation. You want to know what the potential directions are to prepare for them. And it's about making better decisions in the present time to prepare for these alternate futures as well. And that was a quote by Amy Webb, who's got several books on this area. That's really important, and they're really good. So we have the same situation that we talked about earlier when we talked about, design thinking. If you don't do that early, horizon scanning and trying to get the data, and you're just going to be mapping and prototyping futures. And a lot of people do that, right? They don't do the research. They just go directly to the future sort of prototyping. And a lot of companies have done that for years as well. Did little videos of this could be the future, but they're not doing that on the basis of research. I argue that you're still flying blind, like we did when we talked about the here and now. So that's pseudo foresighting. Don't want to do that. One other thing that I wanted to just add before leaving this topic is that there's a method that you can always add to anything you do, even in the here and now. So if you were using design thinking and research and design and all the rest of it the way I talked about it earlier, and you want to have a little bit of a flavor of factoring in the future, I love, and I use it all the time, the pre-mortem. So what is the pre-mortem? You have a team, might be a startup, might be a student team. I've done this a lot with my teaching. And you're all really excited about, you've now ideated the solution, you've now got this mapped out version of what the future might, this new system that you're going to be building is, that it's going to be amazing, it's going to be the best thing in the world. You might be creating, for example, a social network. Let's say we imagine ourselves back, a number of years. So you know what, connect everybody. And people can share photographs of their family and stories of what they're doing and everything. It's wonderful. The whole world's going to be wonderful, and we're so positive about the future. Well, what this pre-mortem exercise is you basically imagine yourself that it's now in the future, might be 6 months to a year, and your idea that you came up with in the work that you've already done thus far has been in the world, has been implemented exactly the way that you're imagining it. It's been in the world for a year, but it's been a total and utter failure. Why did it fail? So you don't think about what possibly could fail. You imagine the failure. This thing absolutely, read the headline, this thing fell apart, right? And then you think about, why did it fail? And you go through all those reasons. And then you go through and you think, okay, given all those reasons why it failed in your imagination, now what mitigations do we need to put in place to strengthen, to future-proof, essentially, the solution that we have? So if you were creating that social network idea, let's say, and you imagine that, well, maybe there'd be some bad actors in there. Well, just be families wanting to share pictures of their kids and stuff like that. Maybe there's some bad actors that want to influence elections, or they want to just, influence people to get their money, and they're going to go, whatever those things are. If you'd imagine that in the beginning, when you started this idea that it's going to be great, it's going to revolutionize the world, then you could have put the mitigations in place to say, you know what, let's put the safeguards in place now to prevent that, right? And that's what I think is an incredibly powerful method, even when you're designing for the here and now, to just imagine this failure, to do this pre-mortem. When you first introduce it to a team, they're like, oh my God, talk about, killing the party here. We were thinking that we were going to be so effective, but it's so good at future-proofing what it is you're doing. So it's a little bit of strategic foresighting, even if you're designing for the here and now. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about, we talked about how do we do design work appropriately and the things you shouldn't do. You shouldn't do pseudo design, etc. And you don't want to do pseudo strategic foresighting either. Let's talk a little bit about what do we need to do with design education. So the education that we give students today is future-proof, and that they're future-proofed as well, based on what they learn. So what's the problem here? So I like to suggest that design education's relevance to the world right now is, I would suggest, if you look at past, present, and the future, I think that we're somewhat behind even the present in terms of what we need. And this isn't like every school. I often get all these, all this feedback saying, "Oh, come on, what about this school?" But across the board, I think that most education, and there's some really good exceptions, but are kind of even behind the current needs in today's sort of world. And where we want to go is to also prepare students for the future and what designers and researchers are going to need to do in the future. So what do we need in order to do that? We need to be able to know how to design for the future, so strategic foresight, that kind of work. We want to design for mental health. Huge problem right now for all the things that we've been designing, all these startups, all these scale-ups, all building these things on our phones that are there to grab our attention, right? And we're realizing that together with the pandemic and all the rest of it is just causing a whole lot of mental health problems. So I think we need to design appropriately to prevent mental health problems. We need to be designing for the environment. We need to factor in when you're thinking, and a suggestion when you're using design thinking methods and you're looking at a stakeholder map, the earth should be one of your stakeholders, right? And so, and a really important one. So if you're thinking of doing something, you need to satisfy that and not just the financial needs of the organization, et cetera. So again, and that's only one really small example, but there's a lot we need to be building in there. We want to design for and with all races. A lot of design today has still been way too focused on the origins of a lot of the design practices and also the design education out of Europe initially. So I think we need to really make sure that we're factoring in the global South, on what it is that we're doing, that we're thinking about the even the aesthetics and importance of other cultures and what they're going to contribute, as well. So it's really been very kind of narrow thus far, and I think we need to be embracing all of those. Then we're going to design for new technologies and the need for them, as well as like an early technology to be able to use all the power of that design has to make sure that we're not designing technologies that are going to be bad for the world and bad for its citizens, but that it actually improves people's lives as well. And as I said earlier, designing for and with all cultures. Again, a large part of design has been and still comes from certain parts of the world, but in actual fact, it's then used all over the world. Well, we should be making sure that we're actually designing for sort of all cultures. And the last one is to anticipate the unintended consequences. We often say something goes wrong, and there's a big news article, and the CEO is being interviewed. And it's always like, well, we had no idea that this was going to come up. Well, like I just said with the pre-mortem discussion, we should be thinking about, and we should be training students of design and research to be able to do the work to discover those unintended consequences for things like the pre-mortem, but also doing strategic foresight to, the direction this is going, this is going to be a really important thing. What do we do to address that challenge? So these are all the kind of requirements that we have for kind of future education from my point of view. And I got together with a guy that many people know in the industry, Don Norman. He and I were spending a weekend to think about, what the state of design education was and where did we need to go. And we decided to found this new team called the Future of Design Education Initiative. And we basically said the kinds of challenges that I just mentioned to you earlier, let's now take education up a level, even just across the board, even the foundations of each of the subdisciplines of design, taking that up, but also having this view to making sure that we're addressing the kinds of things that I just mentioned on the last chart. So what do? We built a steering committee of a variety of half from education, half from practice or industry and the like, that really were all eminent in their own area that would guide this overall effort. And then we created basically working groups for particular themes with regard to what we needed to do. And we built teams, people that are the most knowledgeable in each of these areas to build the appropriate curricular guidance with regard to each of these areas. And then we also had close to 700 volunteers that wanted to help with this, about half, again, from practice or industry and about half from academia. And so we've been at this for a couple of years now. And we've been building this set of curricula. You can go to thefutureofdesigneducation.org. That site will tell you more about what it is that we've been doing. But we're probably for the end of this year, maybe a little bit into next year, we can have sort of the final kind of report from the work that we've been doing. And it basically hits on kind of what are the biggest ideas in each of the themes that we've been working on, and then what are the curricular elements that need to be put in place, and then what are the learning outcomes that we will get from doing that work. And then this is intended for design schools, universities, even cross-disciplinary work as well. And we also looked at non-degree programs as well, like what education needs to be provided in the bootcamp type programs that are all now out there as well. So right across the full spectrum. And here's guidance for how to develop appropriate courses. We also going to have guidance for university presidents and presidents of design schools in terms of even how design should be infused into and broader influence of a whole organization. So more to come on that, but I think it's a really exciting focus on where education should go in the future as well. And with that, I want to thank you. And these are my coordinates if you want to connect into any of the places that I hang out, and also including my website, karelvredenberg.com, where I write about this kind of work as well. So with that, let me unshare, and then we can get into a good session of Q&A. And so turning it over to Valeria.
Thank you very much. That has been amazing, really. If you guys have any questions, just raise your voice or write it in the chat.
Yeah, maybe if you write in the chat, it's probably good. If there's a few, so we can at least go through them.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I love to do these too, by the way, while you're thinking and writing, is that anything goes. It's like, ask me anything. So anything about what I presented or anything beyond that, as well is fine.
I could start just one. I've just been. Have you been ever using the Cynefin framework? Dave Snowden's Cynefin.
Yeah, we actually have so for the future design education work is factoring in a lot of that work. And I think that I should also mention sort of at IBM lead an effort, and we have a work effort that is looking at taking our methods up a level. And so that work is also looking at every model right now. And I think that the details will be in those teams' work, but and I'm not privy to the all the details with regard to that. But yeah, but if you want to reinforce why we should be in particularly focused on the one that you mentioned, David.
Yeah, no, because I mean he worked with IBM 20 years ago, but it's just interesting about how it's like Cynefin is a framework for decision making. So it's just, and it gets into ethnography and interviewing users and letting users kind of make their own narrative and kind of understand their own stories. So,
Yeah. No, I think the fundamentals of the way that I presented it, that at IBM we use the enterprise design thinking, model, and everything hangs off that. And the problem that, as I mentioned, is a lot of the time when people do design thinking, they're forgetting about research.
Yeah.
They're only thinking about it as a workshopping method. Answer the question about interested in which books will help with foresighting, please. I will make that available. I can't think of them. I've got them at home. How do you?
How to share pre-mortem with stakeholders without losing wine from D.
Yeah, I think that I think you want to do the pre-mortem, your core little team that did the research work, that is doing the ideation of what the solution is going to be. I would add it just as another design thinking method. We say, okay, you know what? Before we get to the detailed design or even the to-be scenario, let's actually take the ideas that we've just come up with and imagine those ideas have hit the ground running and the thing failed. It's just, and you can do it repeatedly. And once you have now prototyped something, you say, okay, now given what that's like, how do we further future-proof that? And stakeholders, after you've done that exercise, telling that back to the stakeholders to say, by the way, we've also done this, analysis that looked at, we future-proofed this, by the way. Here's the 5 things we did. We anticipated that this might happen. We put this in place. We anticipated this would happen, and your stakeholders will be even more confident with regard to what you're doing if you actually show that you've done that level of understanding. That makes sense, Steve?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks so much, Karel.
Great. Yeah, sorry, we have another one. So are you optimistic about the future of design education in regards to some of the topics you mentioned before, like mental health and environment, etc.? How can we make companies to be more involved about this new design thinking?
Yeah, I think that I'm optimistic about most things, and certainly the power of design and research to do the right thing. I think we should actually be using design to design curricula in universities. Weird thought, right? But the universities I've worked in fact, even tomorrow, just an example, I'm running a session with a representative set of students that were in this executive MBA program that I teach in. Spending the morning with them, understanding the value they got, what they're missing, that kind of an exercise. And then I'm playing that back to all the faculty in the afternoon, tomorrow afternoon, to further strengthen the program. And that's never done. Schools just teach every year, and there's even now a few schools that right at the top of the university, there's a requirement for using research methods and design methods to design curricula. So before a new course is introduced or a new program is introduced, they're required to do the kind of things that we do in design, like understanding what the students' needs are, what the industry needs are with regard to the education that they're going to be coming up with, and then even getting the feedback on the iterative versions of the course and the like. I think the days of a prof just creates a course and just starts teaching it, I think are gone. And when you think about it, I always like disruption, right? And right now I tell my faculty leaders that I work with that at universities, for example, that they've got a major challenge coming from the bootcamps. So what did bootcamps do, right? They're really clear in terms of what they're going to deliver for you and what you're going to get out of it, typically quite expensive, but it's not very long. And what do those organizations do? They pivot every single time they teach a course, right? What worked, what didn't work, they go and change it. And that typically doesn't happen in universities. A prof might teach the same course the same way for years, right? And that's not, again, every single one, but I think that kind of thing. But I think that there really is and when you ask the question about what about the other things that I talked about, will that get into education? Well, it has to. When you think about the people that are, people that are going to be taking that education, what are they doing right now in terms of what they're buying when they're buying products? They're going to look for things that are more environmental. They're going to look for things that are more equitable, right? And you're paying. It's a product you're buying, right? And if there be, let's say, one university that is just, by the way, this is what we've done in our education program. It's got environmental focus on environmental, social issues and the like, and another one just is traditional old. Which one's going to win out? And even more so, the boot camps are going to be able to differentiate themselves with this kind of thing as well. So I definitely think that that's the case, and I think that companies are out of necessity having to do this now, right? So there's a whole focus now that if they're even more directly linked to the market universities typically aren't. They make their money from students coming in and endowments and all that kind of thing. But there's often not as clear a linkage in terms of the market. But when you think of companies, if you're continuing to do things that are really bad for the environment, it's going to catch up to you, right? So I think that's where and we have, for example, an enterprise design thinking for sustainability practice within IBM. We actually work with a lot of companies on that. Companies that are wanting to be more environmental. Well, we've got a bunch of design practices to help with that.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Marina. Just looking through the questions here. Nicholas, how can we get user research to integrate into Foresight prototyping projects? Do you want to expand on that, Nicholas?
Oh, sure. Just that in the model that Karel showed real briefly, it only mentioned mapping. And I guess I just wonder what his thoughts are on getting real people to, that's the classic problem, right? Is you can't get users to think about what they might deal with in the future. They can only react to what you show them. So just curious if his thoughts are on that.
Yeah, good question. And I think it is the case that foresighting is more challenging because you can't, like you said, go in and interview the here and now. But there's a variety of different methods. One that is actually somewhat unusual was to actually go through and get people to even think about themselves in the future. So if you're looking at this is what you do today, imagine yourself, 10 years from now, what would you be doing 5 years from now or whatever, and that actually is a bunch of people plan that far ahead. This is what I'd be doing, and I wouldn't be doing this or whatever. So, but you put your finger on, what are the challenges? But the challenges from a research point of view is picking up on, for example, when we look at the pandemic, we had to do that a lot during the pandemic, right? And so you can ask people questions like, what like for this conference that we were talking about doing, would you be comfortable if let's say the rate of the pandemic in terms of number of cases or whatever, at what rate would you feel comfortable being in an enclosed space with several hundred or several thousand people? And they'll tell you that in the future, when that happens, they're still not going in, or a certain percentage would say, you know what, if the case counts down to that level and maybe everybody was wearing a mask or whatever, they can start to, even based on their own perspective today, they can tell you kind of this is what my intention would be and the like. But I think there's new methods being developed all the time. There's hundreds in the strategic foresight area. I don't know them all, but I think that's one of the challenges though, and you put your finger on it.
Okay. Is the question answered, Nicholas, for you?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Perfect, great. The next question, Anastasia, so the current company culture is still growing in adopting research into the design process. My team has been actively integrating research, but others are having designers conduct usability testing. I'd like to promote a research-first approach to design teams across the company as a solo researcher. It seems workshops have not been productive in the past. I have started a blog on our internal wiki. What other avenues can I pursue to support teams and encourage better research practices?
Great question, Anastasia, and I empathize with you being the sole researcher in your company. I'll provide a little bit of insight. So I, probably about 20 years ago, would run workshops at design conferences. And I'd have a show of hands. How many people in the room are the only designer in their company? Right? So 80% of the room put their hands up. Right? That was the state of design back 20 years ago. I think we're at the same stage now for research in many companies, right? Where we have a fledgling research practice, and I think we need to have, in order for design to be more effective, and a lot of organizations have bought in and hired a whole lot of designers, but in order for designers to truly be effective, we need to have a really good research practice. And so, and some companies have really got that message, other ones haven't. But specifically to your question, Anastasia, in terms of how to do that, I think choosing, for one thing, I think the researchers should be doing the most important piece of research that the company needs, the organization needs. So if, for example, the design team is asking for evaluative feedback, usability studies and the like, and yet there's a really important need for some generative research to really determine whether the products, even the strategy the company has got, is working. You as a researcher shouldn't be spending your time on evaluative research, and you want to what's called democratize research and actually just put some training wheels on the research and have your designers do some of that evaluative feedback, maybe on each other's design or something. I think researchers, especially given limited number of you, in your case one, I think you want to choose to work on something that's going to be so central to the importance and the future of the company. And that when you do that piece of work, that will lead the way to say, you know what, we need a whole lot more Anastasias in this organization, because my God, what you just did is really, really insightful. And I would suggest largely, if you're just doing usability testing, that won't be that thing, right? Not to put down usability testing, we need to still do it, but that's giving you largely incremental improvements, when in actual fact you can be even more impactful if you looked at, for example, their go-to-market strategy and getting user feedback on that. And so I think look at the big picture, talk to your CEO, talk to whoever might really know the picture, get a sense of, like I said, with the structured interviewing that we did with doctors, what's keeping them up at night, about the way the organization's progressing. Do work on that, have great impact. That will progress your career, and it'll also give way more strength to your point of saying we need to have more people here as well. And so, and doing the usability testing on training wheels, is like I like to call it. It's more a matter of saying, okay, you know what? Here are the guidance. This is what you should do. Here it is, and do the plan for them and everything. So they just need to execute it, and to avoid them being too biased in terms of coming and saying, don't you love this design? That it's actually getting people to do the actual activities the way that they should. But that's the approach that I would say. Make sense, Anastasia?
Yes, thank you, Karel. And you've certainly hit on it, where I've already had them escalate to using a centralized repository to capture all our findings across teams so we can see that larger scale strategy.
Great.
They seem to be on board. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much.
Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left.
Yep.
So we have four questions. So we'll try and get through them.
Yeah, I would say we can run through the questions. Yeah.
So Daniel asked, as someone out of college, what do you recommend the most sought after career paths? Product designer, visual designer, particularly in UX design.
Yeah, really good question, Daniel. And I think that I think they're all strong. I just think, given my comment earlier, I think that research is really underserved. And if you can combine together a career path in research. So right now, there's only, I think, 3 schools that you can actually get a degree in user research. So most of the people that are in research came from psychology, sociology, ethnography, whatever. And in fact, at IBM, we're building a dedicated course because I'm frustrated that there's not a consistent set of knowledge in the research community that I've got to level up their skills. But so I think that it's I think you can cobble together. And that's the other thing I would suggest, is that you don't have to be a single thing, right? And so if you're somebody that let's say is a researcher, but also has some great skills in visual design, wow, what an amazing a combination. If you have some skills in UX design, but also can do a bit of coding, again, a combination always makes you even more valuable, and not only more valuable in being hired, you're also going to be more effective yourself. So if you know a bit of coding and as a UX designer, you'll be able to know what's possible, what's not, even if you wouldn't be building the production code, for that thing as well. So I think and the other thing I would suggest, Daniel, is to reach out to people that are in these fields. Go and look at somebody up in LinkedIn and reach out to them and say, can we just have a conversation, or even just a conversation back and forth in the chat, in the DMing on Instagram, on LinkedIn rather, to get a sense of like, what do they do? What do they love about their job? What's the biggest challenge and the like? And so when you're in school is the best time to kind of reach out, and you'll be surprised how many people will actually respond to you and be supportive of the questions that you want to ask.
Yeah, that's a great comment about reaching out to people when you're just coming out of college or trying to learn. It is amazing how people will get back to you, and they're only too happy to share knowledge. So it's a good thing to do. Okay.
Yeah. Perfect. So let's go to the next question. So I'm currently working with a company that has a very low UX maturity. They did start to embrace agile development in June 2021 and now have an agile coach and some scrum master. My superior and I are shopping for someone to help with level UX maturity. Will that be your team?
Oh, interesting question, Rob. And I think so first of all, with regard to Agile can be a good friend to design and research, but it can also be horrible in the sense that I think what a lot of people that do Agile think they're in Nirvana mode because you can iterate all you want, and so we don't have to actually understand what we're doing because we can modify it, as I said earlier, right? But if you imagine that that you've got the canvas, that a product can either be up here in this canvas or this down here in this canvas of all the possibilities that it could be, right? There's no way that if you're starting with Agile and you're starting here and starting to iterate and then getting feedback on it, that you're going to end up down here. You're only going to be modifying a little bit of what it is you're going to do if you're doing Agile. That's why you really need greater UX maturity to your question. And my team doesn't do that. We're on the product side of the house, but the consulting part that I also have responsibility for researchers there. They do this kind of thing. So reach out to me, and they certainly have a research practice now that's part of a dotted line, part of my team that they help other companies with, as well. So yeah, I think you really need to ramp up, and your company would be even more successful if you did that. And some of the time it's just like a bit of bootstrapping, get doing it and then get even advice on sort of who to hire and that kind of thing. So it might be a short-term engagement, but yeah, and follow up with me, Rob, and I'll get you connected.
Great. Joanna asks, when you think of future alternatives, how do you stop yourself from future alternative paralysis, i.e. thinking of far too many future alternatives and not knowing which ones to take forward?
Yeah, it's a really important issue. I mean, and I think, like with everything, right? It's like how many times do you iterate, on design? Do you just keep doing it forever? Well, yeah, you do until you ship, and then you iterate some more, right? So I think same thing with the futures work. The most important part of it, though, is that you need to land and deliver stuff. So you can get into analysis paralysis, and I think probably the strategic futures area that has more of that than others because it's in the future. But I think, in our practices, it's like, okay, let's go do this work, and then let's decide on, okay, we've now got enough insight into these alternate futures. Let's actually choose one and build out the details of it. But we'll be prepared that if we need to go pivot some more, we'll be there as well. So the rule of thumb that I've been using is all of like about 3, the magic number of 3. So don't think of every possible future, but really get it down to some reasonable number, and it shouldn't be 1.
Thank you so much. That makes perfect sense. Thank you, Karel.
Great. Thanks so much, John.
Okay, so let's move to the last question there. For people who can go through university or a bootcamp, what would you recommend to them to evaluate their own education or improve? Is there an essential list of the basics, intermediate, or advanced topics to follow along?
it's just a great time right now to get virtually any kind of education. It's like I'm so jealous. I mean, of the times we live in now. That if you really want to, learn anything, it's available online. So for example, the Nielsen Norman Group has some really good courses that you can take online. There's others as well, so you don't have to go. And boot camps right now are virtual as well, so it's not like you need to go somewhere to do it necessarily. I think if you identify what it is that you want to learn, really importantly, read the reviews of the people that are there. Some of the, especially boot camps even, some of them are really good. Some of them are when you hear, they promise a lot. All of them promise a lot, but there's no hope in heck of after 6 weeks, let's say, of getting the same level of knowledge that somebody would get after a 4-year degree, for example, right? Some of the time they give the impression that that's the case, and that's just not the truth. I did an analysis, by the way, of the people that we hired out of boot camps. I followed up with the managers and said, what's your assessment of these people that you hired compared to like 4-year or 6 years in university? And what's really interesting is that because most of the time they're second careers, that the people coming out of those schools have a broader perspective on the world. They've got a way better perspective on where of whatever it is that we're working on. They're not myopically focused, for example, and they're just going to do the visual design. They've got a bigger picture view, but also they don't have as deep a skill in terms of each of those areas. So they still need to ramp up, as well. But so. And right now, a lot of schools are not requiring, a lot of universities, a lot of companies are not requiring degrees anymore. Our company doesn't, Google doesn't, for example. So it's a great time to develop skills in whatever way you want. And so doing things like all this online education, do it, and then go choose some things to redesign, redesign Facebook. Redesign the CNN homepage, whatever, as an exercise. Even if you're not able to do work, if you're not working right now, or you're in school or whatever, just apply what you've learned to a problem and put that in your portfolio, and even mark it as this is a design exercise I did, but it shows what you're capable of, right? It's a great time to be hired just because you're great at what you do, as opposed to what credentials you have. And that doesn't take away that there's value to the credentials, by the way. There's a huge value to the credentials. And when I look at my team of researchers, a good number of the most successful ones have PhDs, right? So there's obviously a need for a depth of skill as well, but it's a way more open playing field now in terms of skills.
Perfect. So I think it's time to finish. Thank you very much for your time and for everything you taught us tonight.
Thanks everybody for joining.
Exactly. Thanks everybody as well.
Have a great rest of the day. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.